Imagine returning to a grave you helped fill the day before, expecting the same damp earth and the same lid of wood beneath your feet, only to find the soil freshly turned, the coffin lighter, the world strangely hollow. That image haunted cities across Britain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, funerals attended by the poor, graves dug rapidly, and by night a second industry moving through churchyards and burial grounds to take what had been buried. It was not ghosts they feared. It was men who dug up the dead, carried them through alleys, and sold them to the very institutions that claimed to heal the living. How did a series of crimes that began with theft end up forcing Parliament to rewrite the rules about who could be taken from the earth and handed to anatomists? How did the commerce in corpses, born of scientific necessity, economic pressure, and social neglect, become the catalyst for one of the most consequential legal reforms of the age? This is the story of demand and supply colliding with poverty and law, and of a disturbing case that, in the public mind, made government act. The study of the human body had, by the beginning of the 19th century, become central to medicine. From the time of Vesalius in the 16th century, dissection had moved from a rare spectacle to a regular part of medical instruction. As hospitals multiplied and medical schools expanded, more students needed bodies to learn from. Anatomy was no longer a curiosity for the elite. It was a practical discipline, a craft that required hands trained on flesh. But the law did not keep pace. For centuries, the supply of corpses available for dissection had rested on a bleak coercive policy, the Murder Act of 1751. That law permitted the bodies of executed murderers to be handed over for anatomical dissection as an additional punishment. It was a legislative attempt to deter crime by adding a public, deep humiliation to execution. It was not, however, a policy designed to serve the educational needs of an expanding medical profession. The number of executions yielded only a trickle of specimens. Medical schools multiplied far faster than the queue at the gallows lengthened. Students searched for real bodies to practice on. Surgeons wanted fresh tissue. The practical result was a market pressure that the law had not foreseen. Economics is often colder than morality. When there is a scarce commodity that commands a price, human ingenuity and human greed invents ways to obtain it. Resurrectionists, as the men who exhumed bodies were called, filled that niche. They were neither myth nor an occasional rogue operator. They were an informal trade. Grave robbing had a routine. The work required speed, skill, and secrecy. Her coffin might be dug up within days of burial, cloth wrappings cut away, the body, sometimes preserved or concealed in a basket for transport, sent to a medical school or to a middleman who would find a buyer. For those who bought corpses, a fresh specimen was worth far more than a remnant. In the twilight economy between the churchyard and the anatomy theatre, freshness equaled money. Communities developed an arsenal of defences. Some parishes employed watchmen, whose job it was to keep vigil over the new graves. Other families invested in metal cages, placed over the coffin, or in cumbersome iron frameworks called mort safes that locked over the slab until decomposition had made the body less desirable. In poorer districts, families could not afford such precautions. Their dead were more vulnerable. In some places, undertakers and mourners buried bodies in hard-to-dig clay pits or added heavy stones. Yet these measures were never foolproof. The resurrectionists adapted. They worked in teams, timed with knowledge of watch schedules, and developed techniques for quickly removing a coffin lid or for bribing a gatekeeper. The trade was clandestine but professionalized. It required knowledge of anatomy, of which towns were lax, and of routes to move bodies to buyers without attracting disturbing attention. The presence of this trade was a public scandal. For the families who found their graves violated, it was a violation not just of property but of dignity. For the middle classes and the literate press, however, the problem took on a different edge. The idea that hospitals and colleges might be buying bodies procured by thieves presented an ethical dilemma. Should education be built on instruments of crime? And if institutions were willing to pay, what was to stop the traders from taking more drastic steps to secure fresher, more valuable specimens? It was into this gap, between the need for bodies and the insufficiency of lawful supply, that the most chilling escalation took place. Grave robbing, with its theft and indignity, was eventually eclipsed by something far darker. The most notorious precedent came not from London, but from Edinburgh, where two men, William Burke and William Hare, moved beyond exhumation. Operating in the early 1820s, they began to supply a local anatomist with corpses that had not been recently buried, but had been taken from living people. Their method, as they later confessed, involved killing victims to obtain fresh bodies. They sold them to Dr. Robert Knox, who used them in his anatomy lectures. The Burke and Hare case became a grotesque template in the public imagination, murder for profit disguised as legitimate supply. Edinburgh's horrors did something peculiar. They compressed the abstract fear that scientific demand could corrupt social mores into concrete, terrible acts. Newspapers ran lurid accounts. People debated whether anatomists were complicit, whether demand had incentivized murder, whether the law ought to do more than punish the men who killed. Burke's eventual execution and public dissection fed a mixture of horror and morbid curiosity. For the public, the line between theft and killing had been crossed. For those in London's anatomy trade, the case raised an immediate question. If men could kill for profit in Scotland, could the same happen in England's capital? London, with its crowded neighbourhoods and sprawling burial grounds, was already a fertile ground for resurrectionists. Neighbourhoods like Bethnal Green, with their garden squares and working-class cottages, bore the brunt of urban poverty. In one walled garden that would later be known infamously as Nova Scotia Gardens, a small gang of men operated in the shadows. They were a different class of criminal than the solitary grave robber. They worked together in a network, men who could supply a buyer, men who could move a body, men who mixed the practical knowledge of burial with the ability to dispose of difficult remains. At the centre of the group that would come to be called the London Burkers were three names that would be echoed in courtrooms and newspaper columns: John Bishop, who was the leader; Tom Williams, an accomplice whose hands did much of the work; and James May, sometimes called Jack Stirabout or Black-Eyed Jack in contemporary reports, who acted as transporter and seller. Together, they moved bodies from the city to the anatomy classrooms of King's College and other institutions. Their operation was not invisible. Badly paid labour, late-night taverns, and the invisibility of the poor combined to create opportunities. A homeless person left to wander, a child living in a tenement with no home to call its own, a foreign labourer whose disappearance would be noted only by a distant relative. These were the populations most at risk. The law protected property and the wealthy more reliably than it protected the lives of the marginalized. The case that finally drew attention started with a single boy. The exact identity of the child is a matter of historical debate. Records suggest a likely identification as Carlo Ferrari, though some details remain indefinido. What is clear is this: a young body, unusually fresh, was delivered to a medical school in London. It was not merely the fact of the delivery that raised concerns. It was the condition of the body that made the demonstrators and assistants uneasy. At King's College, Richard Partridge, the demonstrator, took the responsibility of examining the specimen. Partridge was experienced in distinguishing the freshness of a cadaver from the later stages of decay. His instincts told him something was wrong. The tissue suggested recent life. The circumstances of the delivery, who had brought the boy, where he had been found, the presence of items in the parcel, raised immediate, hard questions. Imagine being the man called to look at a dead child and realizing that the death had likely not been natural. Imagine the moral vertigo, a scientific facility accepting bodies to teach students how to repair the living, and yet the body in its hands possibly the product of a crime. Partridge acted not as a sensationalist, but as a professional who saw an anomaly and reported it. He alerted colleagues. A formal inquiry began. The police were drawn in. Joseph Sadler Thomas, a superintendent whose role included investigating serious public crimes, took up the matter. The men who had delivered the body, James May among them, were traced to houses in the vicinity of Nova Scotia Gardens. Neighbours' testimonies, in the days before modern forensics, were crucial. People remembered seeing the men with strange bundles, recall of late-night comings and goings, and the purchase of supplies that now bore a suspicious light. Witnesses mentioned the kind of advertisements, not for the body itself, but for tobacco and rum and cheap wares, the normal accoutrements of a neighborhood's commerce, which then tied to the traders' movements. Little acts, ordinarily meaningless, combined to build a picture of a ring that moved bodies for money. Investigators searched the cottages associated with the gang and found items that, when placed together, created an alarming narrative. There were articles of clothing that matched missing persons. There were tools and vessels that spoke of recent, awkward transport, and crucially evidence of attempts to conceal or dispose of material, pits and wells where bodily remains or paraphernalia might be hidden. Local reports described wells in garden plots where something had been sunk, perhaps in haste. The presence of bottles and powders within the houses, substances later described in testimony as laudanum or other narcotics, was noted in police statements and in confessions. Those who would later speak in court offered accounts of drugs being used to render a victim pliant, then of bodies being taken into cottages or to secluded yards where they could be prepared for sale. It is necessary to underscore that many details of method were presented in confession or witness testimony. Historians mark them as alleged or confessed rather than as incontrovertible fact. The investigation also unearthed a pattern of commerce. James May, in particular, emerged as a man who had connections to medical school dealers and who had a history of transporting bodies for modest sums. When questioned, he admitted to moving corpses and selling them on behalf of others. His cooperation, whether born of conscience calculation or a desire to lessen his own culpability, became a pivot in the case. Through May, the investigators traced a chain of supply, and through Bishop and Williams, they began to point to the center of a network that borrowed burial rites and turned them into a criminal enterprise. Confronted with the accumulating evidence, confessions began to surface. Some of these were full and damning, others were partial, overlapping, and at times contradictory. Men under the strain of interrogation, and men who might hope for reprieve in exchange for testimony, described techniques that read like practical instructions for murder and concealment. They spoke of rendering victims unconscious by force or by drugs, of moving bodies through cellars and alleys, and of disposing of remains in wells where the water and darkness would hide the traces. In a few accounts, the name of a woman appeared, Fanny Pigburn, listed among the known victims. Another name that came forward during identification efforts was Cunningham. The surname is recorded, but the full particulars of identity remained indefinido. Each name on the list represented a life cut short, and each was a mirror held up to the city's indifference to the poor. The discovery of the boy's body at King's College did not exist in isolation. Once investigators began pulling threads, they encountered other disappearances and other suspicious deliveries. The notion that these men were merely grave robbers who took from churchyards seemed increasingly untenable. The trade had blurred from theft into something more sinister. A crucial piece of evidence lay in the condition of the corpses themselves. Anatomists and demonstrators testified that some specimens showed signs inconsistent with long burial or decomposition. Freshness, in that context, implied a recent death. When those who had been missing were people with no means to defend themselves, day laborers, itinerant hawkers, children without guardians, the moral calculus shifted. What had been a crime of property now looked dangerously like a crime against persons. Public awareness of the investigation moved in uneven degrees. Newspapers seized on the sensational aspects. Pamphlets and broadsides, the tabloids of their day, hinted at a trade that sold the human body to science irrespective of the body's origin. For many readers, the sequence from theft to organized killing felt inevitable once the market's logic was laid bare. For others, the implication that surgeons and anatomists were complicit remained an accusation without full proof. It was a messy entanglement. Those who needed specimens were not necessarily the same as those who procured them by criminal means, and yet a buyer who refused to make inquiries might be seen as willfully blind. As word spread, the authorities moved to make arrests. Bishop and Williams were detained. James May was brought in and questioned in some depth. The raids on cottages revealed more than clothing and tools. They uncovered a web of testimonies and a ledger of payments that suggested regular transactions. The residents of Nova Scotia Gardens, who had tolerated a great deal because life there was hard, suddenly found themselves at the center of a national scandal. Families who had been too poor to protest now saw their community paraded under suspicion. Newspapers reported the arrests with relish and alarm, emphasizing the grotesque intimacy of men who could take a neighbor, and by their actions make that neighbor an object for scientific study. There was, in the public mind, something especially repellent about bodies being dissected in the name of knowledge, when that knowledge was purchased on the market of misery. It was not merely that the dead had been dishonored, it was that the living had been preyed upon with impunity. The coroner's hearings that followed called witnesses to the stand, undertakers, anatomists, porters, and neighbors. Their testimonies filled in gaps and raised still more questions. How could such a trade have flourished? Why had no authority acted sooner? How many bodies had changed hands without anyone asking where they had come from? The answers were as much about poverty and social invisibility as they were about criminal intent. Amidst the frenzy of discovery, there were professional voices urging caution. Some anatomists insisted that they had no interest in where a specimen had come from. They were focused on the advancement of medicine. Others, more sensitive to public outrage, expressed horror that unlawful bodies might have entered their lecture theatres. Dr. Robert Knox's name, associated with the Burke and Hare scandal in Edinburgh, hovered over discussions, a reminder that the market for fresh corpses had already produced murder once. Those familiar with the anatomy trade recognized that legal supply had to be rethought if the problem was to be solved. But legislative inertia and complicated moral questions had so far prevented decisive action. For the families of the missing and for the general public, however, the question was immediate and visceral. The arrests at Nova Scotia Gardens felt like a breakthrough. Evidence piled up. Confessions, where they existed, were used to cement the narrative of organized supply. Yet even as law officers prepared charges, the broader implications began to surface. This was not a simple criminal prosecution. The case exposed a systemic failure, a law that had inadvertently created a black market and a society that had allowed some of its members to be invisible until they were taken from the earth. The question about culpability extended beyond the men at the center of the operation to the institutions that had, wittingly or not, provided a market for bodies. The city braced. Crowds gathered outside the courts, hungry for information. The press, eager for copy, printed every rumor and piece of testimony it could find. Families who had lost loved ones searched for closure, for a name to attach to the absence. In the parlors of the middle class, conversation shifted from scientific curiosity to moral panic. Men of property and position, who had once applauded the march of medical progress, now confronted the cost of that progress when it intersected with poverty. Yet legal process moves at a different pace than public outrage. Investigators had to convert suspicion into evidence. Witness statements needed corroboration. Confessions required scrutiny. The men arrested faced the machinery of law, which would demand proof beyond the hurly-burly of rumor and sensation. For the accused, the path from arrest to trial was fraught with strategy, bargains of testimony for leniency, denials mounted in the hope of acquittal, and confessions shaped by fear and self-interest. For the city, the outcome would not merely determine individual guilt, but influence a debate about regulation that had simmered for decades: how to provide anatomy, a lawful, ethical source of bodies, without encouraging violence. The next stages of the investigation would draw in more men, more testimony, and more dreadful possibilities. As the evidence was collated, an unnerving pattern emerged, one that suggested the trade had moved beyond exhumation to something that treated living human beings as commodities. For many citizens, that claim was intolerable. For reformers and legislators, it posed an urgent problem. If the law did not adapt, the market would keep making monsters out of men struggling to survive. And so the city waited, tense and expectant, as authorities prepared the files, swore in juries, and readied a courtroom that would have to sort through confession, implication, and doubt. The investigation had done its work. It had pried open a hidden commerce and revealed the seams by which bodies traveled from street to anatomy school. But unpicking the moral and legal consequences would require more than arrests. It would demand answers from lawmakers and institutions. It would also require a public willing to grapple with how progress sometimes takes shape on the backs of the vulnerable. In the quiet, after a flurry of searches and hearings, a fuller picture began to coalesce. The items recovered from the cottages, the testimonies of neighbours, and the statements of those who had delivered or purchased corpses constructed a map of culpability. But maps can be read in many ways. One reader saw predatory criminals exploiting the law's gaps. Another saw an anatomy trade that, by turning a profit on bodies, had tempted criminality into ever more horrific acts. And a third saw a social order that had left certain lives unprotected, making them easy targets. By the time the files were transferred to the courts, the story had acquired another dimension. The sense that answering these questions would force change. It would compel a reckoning not only with the men who dug and delivered and sold, but with a legal framework that had prioritized punitive spectacle over the ethical supply of bodies for science. The public mood simmered between indignation and curiosity. People wanted to know not only who had done these deeds, but how law and society would respond to prevent their recurrence. The case that had begun with a single suspicious delivery to King's College was now a lens through which the entire anatomy trade was examined. It presented a question that would prove harder to answer than any courtroom verdict. Could a society balance the legitimate needs of medical education with respect for the dead and protection for the living? Could legislation be drafted that would cut off the market for illicit bodies without strangling scientific progress? And who would bear the burden of that transition? As the wheels of justice turned toward a public trial, the atmosphere in London was electric and uneasy. People debated the culpability of anatomists, the motives of the accused, and the moral costs of a medical culture dependent on cadavers. For some, the arrests vindicated long-suspected truths. For others, they raised anxieties about due process and the thoroughness of police work. For victims' families, the stirrings of legal action were a small hope of recognition, if not full redress. What followed from the arrests would matter not only for the men to be tried, but for the law itself. The revelations at Nova Scotia Gardens had torn a corner of the city's social fabric and exposed something raw: the connection between demand for corpses and the suffering that scarcity could unleash. The authorities could prosecute perpetrators, but that would not, by itself, close the market. Only a change in supply, legal, regulated, and ethically defensible, could alter the incentives that had made such crimes conceivable. Parliament would have to reckon with the uncomfortable fact that its laws had created an environment where the dead had become commodities and the poor their primary sources. As the city prepared for trial, the story spread beyond the courts. The names of John Bishop, Tom Williams, and James May appeared in print alongside the names of victims. Questions multiplied. Had similar rings operated elsewhere? How many bodies had been sold to London anatomy schools? What standards did institutions use to verify the origin of a specimen? The answers were partial, provisional, and often unsatisfying. But the momentum toward reform was unmistakable. Authorities, under pressure from a public outraged at the idea of murder for cadaver, realized that a legal remedy was necessary if further abuses were to be prevented. Yet remedying the problem required a delicate legal craft. The Murder Act of 1751 had intended to blend shame with punishment by reserving the bodies of murderers for dissection. Its logic was punitive, not practical. A revised approach would have to provide a steady, lawful supply of bodies without endorsing the commodification of human remains. It would have to navigate church concerns, moral sensibilities, and the demands of science. Lawmakers faced a political calculation: how to pass a statute that would be effective and acceptable to a public newly sensitized by scandal. While politicians deliberated in private, the public spectacle unfolded in courts and churches. The trials, when they came, would be not just criminal proceedings but moral theater. Spectators would gather, pamphleteers would argue, the press would choose its heroes and villains. For reformers, the spectacle offered an opportunity to press for legislative change. For others, it was an occasion for schadenfreude at the misdeeds of criminals. For the poor, however, there was only the anxious hope that laws would protect the living and the dead alike. The case had accomplished something irreversible. It forced a conversation that had long been simmering into the open. Men who had once been invisible, whose deaths might have gone unremarked, now bore names in public records. The trade's mechanics were exposed. The moral argument could no longer be deferred. What remained was the hard work of translating outrage into law, the very thing that would determine whether the city's mourners, when they returned to graves in the morning, would once again find them whole. Even before a verdict was given, the ripples from Nova Scotia Gardens reached the halls of power. Some politicians, appalled by press accounts and buoyed by constituents' demands, began to consider statutory solutions. They discussed allowing hospitals and infirmaries a legal right to unclaimed bodies, those of the destitute who died in workhouses or hospitals without relatives to bury them, thereby creating a lawful pool of specimens that would render illicit trade unnecessary. Others worried about the optics. Would such a law effectively conscript the poor into becoming resources for medicine? Could dignity be preserved in a process that converted unclaimed dead into teaching materials? The moral calculus was complicated, but the initial impetus was clear. From the scandal of bodies supplied through criminal means, a legislative proposal might arise that sought to undercut the market by providing an alternative. Whether that proposal would be just or merely another form of coercion remained to be seen. What could be said with certainty was that the disturbing case unfolding in London had set the legal conversation in motion. It had moved the problem of anatomical supply from the realm of scandal and speculation into the centre of policy debate. And so, as London braced for the courtroom dramas that would grip the city, the story had already advanced beyond a simple whodunit. It had become a question about the kind of society Britain would be, one that allowed a market for bodies to fester, or one that recognized the need for regulation that protected the vulnerable, even as it served the needs of medical science. The answer would not emerge from a single verdict. It would require legislation, debate, and a public willing to confront uncomfortable truths about poverty and progress. The men arrested at Nova Scotia Gardens awaited their day in court. The materials collected by investigators would be sifted, witnesses would be called, confessions would be tested, the press would pack the galleries. But beyond the spectacle of trial, a nation was already asking whether the law would be bold enough to end the illicit commerce that had profited from the dead and preyed upon the living. The stakes were not simply legal, they were moral and social. The case had begun in the most literal way with an empty coffin. It would end, if justice and political will could be found, with a change in the rules that governed what could legitimately be done with human remains. The next act would bring those questions into the open courtroom, where testimony and cross-examination would attempt to pin down motive, method, and responsibility. Those proceedings would be watched not only for their verdicts, but for their consequences. Would they produce punishment for individual crimes, or would they precipitate reform that reshaped how anatomy and the law coexisted? The city's attention, already riveted by images of deserted graves and hurried burials, turned toward the courthouse. There, beneath the arches and in the chatter of print shops, the future of anatomical practice in Britain hung in the balance. The question was no longer merely who had done these awful things. It was whether a society prepared to learn from scandal and to legislate in its aftermath. The trial that followed was less a quiet legal reckoning than a public unraveling. Witnesses were called one after another into a crowded, overheated courtroom. Richard Partridge repeated what he had seen at King's College. A cadaver alarmingly fresh, the manner of its delivery, the men who had brought it. Neighbors described late-night bundles and furtive movements. Porters and dealers spoke of payments and of routes by which bodies passed from street to anatomy theatre. Under oath, some accused men chose cooperation. Others offered denials that cracked under cross-examination. Where the evidence converged, it did so most clearly around the practices of John Bishop and Tom Williams, and around the role of James May as a regular transporter for the trade. The legal process strained to translate rumor into fact. Many details relied on testimony and on confessions that prosecutors themselves characterized as inconsistent in parts. Men who had spent years moving corpses for coin now faced the public consequences of that commerce. Some admitted to handling bodies, some admitted to selling them. A smaller number offered descriptions of methods they had used to render victims helpless. Historians treat these utterances as confessions or allegations rather than incontrovertible chronicles. The court had to decide what weight to give them. When the jury returned, the verdicts reflected the gravity of the accusations and the strength of the evidence the prosecution had managed to assemble. Bishop and Williams were found guilty of capital offences. The sentence handed down was twofold: death by hanging, and the posthumous penalty mandated by the Murder Act for the worst crimes, a fate that would end for them in the anatomy theatre. Those outcomes were, in the eyes of many contemporaries, an unsurprising culmination. They fit the era's appetite for clear retribution. James May, whose cooperation had been more forthcoming, did not face the scaffold. Instead, he was sentenced to transportation to Van Diemen's Land, a punishment that removed him from the British scene and placed him within the Empire's system of penal exile. The executions drew crowds in numbers that are difficult to imagine today. Men and women converged where the gallows were erected. For some it was a civic duty to witness the end of those deemed monsters, for others a grim curiosity. Newspapers chronicled the scene with a mix of moralizing and titillation. After the formal punishment was carried out, another ritual followed that satisfied both law and the public imagination: dissection of the condemned. The bodies of those hanged for murder by statute were lawful subjects for anatomical demonstration. The dissections were framed in two mutually reinforcing narratives: punishment for crime and utility for science. Even as many in the crowd could not entirely untangle their revulsion from their fascination. That spectacle, terrible and instructive in equal measure, fed the larger conversation. If punishment satisfied a desire for justice, the trials and post-execution dissections fed the civic debate about how the law had allowed such a market for bodies to flourish. Legal commentators and politicians read the events in Nova Scotia Gardens as proof that the status quo was untenable. The core question returned again and again: how could medical education be sustained without creating perverse incentives that preyed on the poor and the marginalized? Parliament responded not with immediate panic, but with debate. Members invoked the recent scandals as evidence that the Murder Act's narrow channel, the bodies of executed criminals, could not possibly meet the needs of growing medical instruction. Various proposals were considered. Some suggested stricter policing and harsher sentences for body snatchers. Others proposed licensing mechanisms for anatomical dealers. A more systematic approach gained momentum: create a lawful, regulated supply of bodies by permitting medical institutions limited access to unclaimed corpses from hospitals, workhouses, and prisons. The idea carried an uncomfortable logic. If the market for corpses was driven by scarcity, then alleviating scarcity through lawful channels might undercut the black market. Those who framed the legislation sought to balance several competing imperatives. On the one hand, the state recognized that medical education served the public good. Well-trained surgeons saved lives, and anatomy was indispensable to that training. On the other hand, there was a moral need to respect the dead and to prevent the living, especially the poor, the homeless, and the institutionalized, from being treated merely as raw material for science. Parliamentary drafters aimed for a statute that would discourage grave robbing and the attendant horrors by offering hospitals and licensed teachers access to bodies that had been properly recorded, regulated, and accounted for. The result was the Anatomy Act of 1832. Its provisions, in outline, gave licensed anatomists and medical schools lawful access to unclaimed bodies from workhouses, hospitals, and prisons, required institutions to keep records, and established oversight mechanisms intended to prevent private dealers from acting as middlemen for illicit supply. The Act did not expand the use of criminal corpses as punishment. It sought instead to replace the clandestine market with a regulated flow of material for scientific instruction. For those who had campaigned against the trade in illicit bodies, the statute represented a pragmatic response: provide a lawful alternative to trafficking, and the incentive to steal or kill for cadavers would, in theory, evaporate. The passage of the Anatomy Act did not end controversy. Critics argued that by formalizing the use of unclaimed bodies, the law risked converting poverty into a source of anatomical specimens. The destitute, those who died without next of kin and were unclaimed by family, would disproportionately supply the cadavers for hospitals. Detractors worried about dignity and consent. Reformers and many in the medical profession responded that the law offered safeguards, records, licensing, and institutional accountability that, combined, were preferable to a shadow market in which bodies were obtained without any oversight at all. What the Act did achieve practically was a sharp reduction in the organized resurrection trade. When medical schools could look to a legal source of bodies, the value of illicit supply diminished. The clandestine networks that had supplied anatomists began to dry up. Dealers and smugglers found fewer buyers willing to risk scandal. The macabre calculus that had made murder for cadavers profitable slowed. In the years after 1832, reports of body snatching and sales declined significantly, even if isolated abuses and moral controversies remained. For medical students, anatomy became less dependent on a black market and more integrated into institutional structures that, imperfect as they were, offered documentation and oversight. The legal shift also carried cultural effects. Public outrage over the exploitation of the poor had helped compel the reform. The Anatomy Act can thus be read as a legislative expression of an emergent ethic, that scientific advancement must be reconciled with civic standards of dignity. That reconciliation was incomplete and contested. Some families still feared that a relative's death in a workhouse might lead to their loved one becoming an anatomical specimen. Others feared that medical institutions, hungry for material, might still turn a blind eye in ways that allowed exploitation. The law mitigated the worst excesses, but it did not fully erase the class anxieties at the heart of the scandal. The London Burkers case had nonetheless fulfilled the grim promise buried in the title. It forced lawmakers to change the rules. The chain from discovery to courtroom to statute is not neat and instantaneous, but the causal line is evident. A disturbing sequence of criminal acts, rooted in the supply and demand economics of a growing medical profession and abetted by social neglect, provoked public revulsion. That revulsion, amplified by newspapers and petitions, pushed legislators to devise a new legal framework that would undercut the market incentives that had made such crimes conceivable. In short, the case redefined the legal relationship between corpses and science. The story's human cost was real. Names recorded in coroner's reports, in trial transcripts, and in sketches of the period: Carlo Ferrari, likely; Fanny Pigburn; Cunningham, surname recorded, identity indefinido, remind us that the scandal's victims were not statistics. They were lives that intersected with poverty and invisibility, and their fates provoked a national rethinking about whose bodies could be claimed for science and under what conditions. The legislative solution that followed sought to protect the living by regulating supply, even while it raised difficult questions about consent and dignity for the unclaimed dead. Beyond legislation, the episode prompted introspection within the medical profession. Anatomists and teachers recognized the need for clear provenance for specimens and for ethical standards that would reassure the public. Institutions revised their procurement methods, kept more detailed records, and in many cases tightened oversight of demonstrators and porters who once had operated in the shadows. Medical education continued to advance. Dissection remained central to the craft, but it was now more squarely embedded in a regulated institutional setting rather than dependent on a black market that had terrorized communities. There is another quieter consequence worth noting. The scandals of the era shifted how society understood the relationship between progress and cost. Scientific advances in anatomy, surgery, and medicine brought immense benefits, but they could also bear moral costs when regulated poorly. The London Burkers case made this tension visible in a particularly disturbing way. The public could no longer imagine medical progress as an unalloyed good divorced from social responsibility. The Anatomy Act was not simply a technical fix. It was a legal acknowledgement that scientific need must be balanced by protections for the vulnerable. In the years that followed, grave robbing ceased to be a common fear for most citizens. Families who could afford it still took precautions. Watchmen and mortsafes did not vanish overnight. But the worst forms of organized trade, the rings that had trafficked in bodies, and in some cases in death itself, were curtailed. The markets that had incentivized such behavior changed shape. Institutions assumed a responsibility they had previously evaded or obscured. The law, reshaped by public outrage and political will, established new norms about how human remains could be used for the public good. When we look back, the phrase in the title is less rhetorical flourish than historical reality. This disturbing case did in fact redefine laws, not by a single dramatic bill or a sudden conversion of conscience, but by forcing a sequence of institutional and legislative responses that altered the incentives and processes at the core of anatomical supply. Scandal exposed the danger, public outcry drove debate, lawmakers crafted new rules, and the medical profession adapted to a changed legal landscape. The Anatomy Act of 1832 stands as the legislative hinge that turned Britain away from a perilous dependence on illicit bodies toward a regulated, if still imperfect, system. What remains beyond statutes and court records is the moral lesson. Progress unmoored from safeguards can corrupt. Need without oversight creates markets that prey on the invisible. The tragedies that unfolded in Nova Scotia Gardens and in other parts of Britain were not merely the result of individual depravity. They were the predictable outcome of a social structure that rendered some people expendable. The legal reform that followed did not erase that past, but it did create mechanisms intended to make such exploitation harder to accomplish and more visible when attempted. If there is one final image to take from this history, it is of a city that, forced by horror, chose to legislate. The empty coffin that began the public investigation became, in effect, a catalyst for legal change. Lawmakers rewrote the rules to close the most obvious loopholes and to legitimize a more transparent supply for the needs of medicine. The trade in illicit bodies diminished, the anatomy theatre continued, and society stepped awkwardly and imperfectly toward a new balance between knowledge and dignity. If this deep dive into a troubling corner of history resonated with you, check the description for sources and further reading, and consider supporting research like this through the channel's membership. Thank you for watching.